Now I will invite Professor Sebastian Morris to kind of present his views on the comments made by the keynote address speaker and also the two discussants. Just 1 minute or so for I just introduce Professor Morris for the audience at large. Senior Professor Sebastian Morris is now senior professor in the Co-Institute of Management and is also the chair of the Center for Public Policy and Governance. He has retired from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, after over 25 years of teaching, research, and consultation. His principal interests are the Indian economy, infrastructure development and regulation, public sector and governance, international trade and investments, macroeconomics, and the small industry. Professor Morris, if you can react to the points made by the previous speakers.
Yeah, I think the first point I'd like to kind of talk about is the PLI. Okay? Now, actually, in the book, I'm just posing this issue that perhaps the PLI would work. Okay, there's not enough time or passage of time to really, understand how the PLI would work out. But I have my reservations on it. In fact, the PLI started as the throughput support scheme of at that time, the DIPP, when Dr. Amitabh Kant was there. I can remember a conference in which we argued that, look, it's much better to have coordination between the Commerce Ministry and the Industries Ministry rather than, to give this throughput support scheme. See, our argument was that if you look at both, particularly if you look at China, it reached a point where it had a huge import of electronics at that time, which was, of course, some 15, 20 years before India. And what it did is it gave a huge boost to there was no tariff on CKDs in electronics, that means component imports. However, they discouraged in a variety of ways, including 150% tariff for a short period on electronic goods, the fully assembled ones. But they gave an advance warning, as a result of which almost all the assemblers in the world located to China, and that allowed a screwdriver-based assembly industry to start, which of course gets much derided in India by DT and so on. But given that the assembly started, it was completely true that in no time at all, maybe in 3-4 years, the component manufacturing also started, and you had an explosive electronics industry, and China went on to dominate the world and create a manufacturing ecosystem around electronics and many other industries. So the point is that, India kind of lost out in the sense that it went and had bound tariffs on picture tube on flat screen TVs, on mobiles, on laptops, and other equivalent equipments of mass use at nearly zero tariffs. Okay? So when you have zero tariffs there, but you have higher tariffs on components, you're obviously discriminating against assembly. So in all my discussions with the deity, okay, they would dismiss it by saying, hey, we are not in the business of assembly or screwdriver technology. We want to make DRAM chips and so on. So they actually created a policy by which $6 billion was actually available for DRAM chip manufacturers. That's like putting the cart before the horse. And this is not the first time. I think quite a long time, for quite consistently, the Department of Electronics has been putting the cart before the horse. And as a result, lost the electronics manufacturing game. Because I think that's much easier than, let us say, auto. However, in auto, we succeeded thanks to a certain kind of a import substitution, a certain kind of protective measure linked with exports and linked with also domestic value addition. And that really helped. And that created at least a reasonably good, industry. So when we look at one industry after the other, there are specific stories out there which are industry policy related. However, all of them have not been able to benefit out of what I would call an aggressive macroeconomic policy, which is relatively low interest rates and aggressive exchange rates. Okay. Now, these are the two most important policy measures which have provided the overarching support for industrial policy in East Asian economies. I do believe that these can be done in India, and it has less to do with other kinds of difficulties, and so on that we have. Surely, if our infrastructure production increases and provides inputs to industry at a low enough price, that can also do the job. And in fact, what an undervalued exchange rate does is it kind of compensates for inputs, non-tradable goods and services which get into manufacturing, and creates a tradable sector. So I have a model where I discuss this in an earlier paper that I've not brought into this book, which is to say that actually pure trade theory is highly limiting because it considers two sectors, an export goods sector and an import goods sector. In reality, there should have been a third sector, which is a non-tradable goods sector. So if you have these three sectors, then a lot of the export-led growth can be at an abstract level seen as, a relative underpricing of the non-traded sector to give an advantage to your traded sector, both import substitution and export promotion. In other words, in my model, import substitution and export promotion is possible at the same time, which the World Bank rules out. Okay, and in fact, in a 1995 or was it 1995? Yeah, debate, where John Page comes on. He says, "Look, you Sanjay Lal and all the structuralists are fine. They brought out these facts about Korean and East Asian development, but show to me how the Korean economy always shows a price to importables to price to exportables being close to the global ratio." I say, look, it is actually, and that's the first thing, that the exportable to importable price ratios in all the successful East Asian countries was close to the international boundary prices. However, the price ratio of exportables to non-tradables and similarly of importables to non-tradables was always high thanks to the undervalued currency and also efficient state in providing infrastructure. And on both counts, we have done badly. Our infrastructure goods are either heavily priced, okay, with very little scope for ratting them out. For instance, on energy, on water, on land, and so on. We can't really VAT out these because they're all administered prices which are very high. And that has hit our exports. So to compensate for that, at least for a while, we need undervalued exchange rates. And that is also not being done because our policymakers are not distinguishing between the current account and the capital account. They're quite happy if the capital account surpluses are able to meet the current account deficits. And now when you do that, actually what happens is that you have to maintain a higher interest rate. In fact, you have to maintain a positive Fisher Open. That means, what it means is that the uncovered parity condition has to be violated to give rise to a fairly large violation. And that is higher in India than in almost many of our competing countries. And that necessarily puts a higher cost of capital on India. And therefore, aggressive investments don't take place by the private sector, even though they've shown their capability in going and investing elsewhere in the world. And therefore, the private sector is not really being used fully in India. So hence the trade policy, industrial policy kind of linkage along with interest rates and exchange rates is a fairly done. I mean, it's quite clear that it must happen. And this is the key of East Asian growth. Now, when you look at East Asian growth, the main point that I'm trying to make is the growth is dependent on pushing the production possibility frontier. Sure. But to push the production possibility frontier, you need investments. You don't need to worry about labor because there's an ample supply of labor. Yes, finally you may need to worry about their skilling and all that, but the immediate constraint is never that. So you could actually work with a one-factor model of capacity addition, and hence investments become the key. Okay? In other words, the US cannot do undervalued exchange rates and promote exports because they'll soon run out of. They'll reach the full employment frontier and the wages will rise. Whereas, and Africa also cannot do it because they don't have sufficiently they don't have sufficient sectoral diversity, okay, to have a continuous stream of transformable, tradable goods coming. What were import substitution goods now becoming export goods and so on. So they don't have that. Whereas countries like India, Korea, China, Thailand, they can do it. And when they did this, they had stupendously high growth. It's actually true that China may have grown close to 10%. All the, the statements to the contrary apart. So, which is why China, in about two generations and a half, was able to actually come within striking distance of being an advanced country. And nothing rules that out in India. Okay, we say that, look, capability of the government may be weaker. I agree, but then once we hit a point where the capability has to respond, then it does. Okay, so the demand side push, as which I would call out for, is the right way, because unless the demand works and exposes the logistic and other supply side difficulties, they're not going to get addressed. Okay, because we don't seem to have an administrative machinery which can anticipate problems and address those, except exceptionally. Okay, so that is one point why I would ask for the importance of demand and hence of macroeconomic policy. The second thing is, I will not get into those niggling arguments about the data being wrong, except to point out that there is a serious problem with the measure of inflation. Now, if you look at the let's say food basket in our GDP, it's pretty low. Okay, the GDP coming from the agriculture sector is about 16%, so it could not be more than, say, 22%. Raw food, processed food included, maybe about 25, maybe about 30%, but it used to be about 45%. So this comes from the very fact that the weights have been taken from the consumer expenditure. Okay? Now, the consumer expenditure studies are person weighted. Okay? So they are wonderful indicators of the human condition, but they are not great indicators of consumption per se, because given a vast income inequality in India, you need a specific survey where the consumption is given due weight. Okay? In other words, you need to over survey greatly those who are at the top, and then you'll get the proper estimates. And hence, we always have had this problem that the blown up consumption expenditure through the NSSO and the NAS are hugely different. But they are hugely different in a very systematic way. That means the goods and services which are consumed by the higher classes are underestimated by the NSSO, and very rightly. Okay? So if I apply Maslow's hierarchy, then certain kinds of goods, I can say, are underestimated in the NSSO. And once we recognize that and kind of take that into account, okay, then the correct weight for the food and related items in the CPI would not be 45%, but it would come down to about 32, 33%. So, and that would indicate a different trajectory of inflation. The other point that comes out, which is not a measurement issue, is a simple statement made by Dr. Rangarajan, that look, if I don't worry about CPI, I'm not really talking about the people, is right. But then do I target the CPI over which I have no control? Because if 45% of CPI is going to be food, then and honestly, macroeconomics cannot target anything other than the core inflation. It cannot target commodities. And I would think that given the recent experience of high inflation, which was a logistic inflation, clearly we need to rethink the attack on inflation. Okay? There are interesting supply side and rationing side solutions to inflation. Okay? Suppose if the US, for instance, had on oil a simple ticket which is activated when you have a crisis, which allowed on a per family basis so many liters of petrol to be bought and not more. Okay, and you make it mutually tradable. Okay, and you put a limit on it based on the current consumption. If the current consumption is, let's say, X liters, you come down with 0.75 of X. Now, many of these items which are heavy on the inflation, which make the inflation go up and down, are price inelastic, are income inelastic. Okay, and therefore, to use a demand side measure to handle a supply side inflation, and certainly a logistic side inflation, except temporarily, is going to be highly limiting. And I think this discussion has to go on. Okay, Bernanke puts out a book which talks about inflation targeting, which I would think is the Bible of inflation. And based on that, I think much of the world, much of the central bankers have shifted to inflation targeting. And the claim that is made in that book is that inflation targeting has worked and evidence is provided. But what I would like to ask is the following question. Was it really inflation targeting that worked to reduce Western side inflation, Western economies inflation? Or was it the great role played by China through the supply side, that means through the import, which acted to reduce the inflationary pressure on these economies? So at the same time, when the inflation targeting was being pursued in the Western economies, the import of Chinese goods rose and the terms of trade shifted sharply against China and in favor of the advanced, the importing countries. And that actually, if you put the numbers down, has been a bigger factor in the working of inflation targeting because it happened at the same time. Okay, so and if demand side measures are going to work, then why are they not working right now? Is the question. Demand side measures have clearly a role even in a supply side inflation when it tends to get out of hand. Okay, the second round has it, and there one is in agreement with much of the the mainstream theory. So I would like to emphasize these 2 points, and then a third point that comes out, is the aspect of reform. Okay, and I think that is very important. The first round of reforms were relatively easy. I'm not saying that they were easy in every sense of the term. They would have required great political statesmanship and intellectual capacity to link it up. But let's say once those reforms were done, because they involved, liberalizing, that means removing controls and pushing the economy towards markets. The second rung of reforms actually involved creating the frameworks so that increased private sector participation can come into an area where we are actually, where the state is really weak, namely in infrastructure, in all the market failure industries. Okay, there we are not getting it right because the ability of the Indian state to create the entire gamut of actions which are required for second generation reforms, such as frameworks for PPP, regulatory corrections, the law which is integrated, land acquisition, and all of these, it's not happening at the pace that one would like. And unless these happen, there is going to be a supply side limitation on the growth in India. And I think it's important to realize that the high growth which happened, the tiger period happened, and it coincided with the National Highway Development Program. And that is because at that time, within the Planning Commission, a great deal of creativity happened, by which these programs were actually put in place. Now, I've argued elsewhere, I've written cases on that, and that's a standard kind of tale that I tell to all the administrators and civil servants whom I've had the experience of training, that look at the construction of the entire NHDP, and we'll find that it's an institutional change. It is not a change where me, great civil servant, kind of does things, by girdling my lions and getting down to the field. That kind of change happens, and that, that is useful, sure, but it's not. It's kind of ephemeral because once the person leaves and goes, then things kind of collapse back. But institutional change of the kind which the Planning Commission at that time brought out under, I must say, under Dr. Montek, Ahluwalia, and his lieutenant, Dr. Gajendra Haldia, was extremely important. And I'm not saying it now, but I've said this in so many training programs long ago. And when we identified, that the GQ actually led to the big push-up and was the first kick that brought the economy back on rails. And then, of course, the positive, what Dr. Sudipto Mundle also brought out, and what Nagaraj also brought out, the service sector, the IT sector, which began to kick in, the world economy reviving, and so on. So there were other factors, but I think this was the one that kick-started and remained. And this is what kept the private investment rate up. So I'll end by saying that the key challenge today is to bring back private investment to those high rates of growth in every sector, including in the investment in the infrastructure sectors, where to some extent it's happening thanks to the old creative efforts during the Vajpayee's time. But in new areas like, let's say, sewerage, sanitation, drinking water, it's not taking place. Municipal infrastructure, city infrastructure, it's not taking place. In multimodality, we have reverted back to state building inefficient infrastructure. So that's a challenge, and also by the demand side being pulled back, private investment rising in the tradable goods sector, where the private sector's capabilities are beyond doubt. So India has a wonderful private sector. We just need to give them the space, and they will do the job. Of course, we need an appropriate regulation so that they don't finesse in other areas of market failure. They don't finesse the others. And last of all, I would say that there is a public sector. Either we give it autonomy, and if we give it autonomy, it can work wonderfully. Okay? Because there's no lack of any capability out there, intrinsic human capability out there. Or we shut shop and say, okay, we are not going to do it. Now, the point is, as long as we have in the public sector, we don't seem to be able to give it the autonomy that is required. Okay? So these, I would think, are, in pragmatic terms, the challenges. Okay. And I'll stop here. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions.
Like later, wait for the question. Before that, Professor Dr. Ahluwalia, if you have some more comments to make.
Sebastian referred to the work that was done in the Planning Commission, but I was actually hugely assisted by, in fact, the work was actually led by my colleague Gajendra Haldia, to which I think he was referring. And I think it is really true that, it's frequently said, for example, that the NHDP program was well conceived. In my book, Backstage, I have recounted what actually happened. Prime Minister Vajpayee made an announcement that we must construct highways running from the north of India from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Gujarat to Arunachal Pradesh. And everybody was very excited at that because obviously all the chaps thought, well, lots more business. It was in the Planning Commission that we said, look, there already is a golden quadrilateral which carries about 60% of the traffic. So what you should do is to create a new highway development program, not based on a prime ministerial speech, but based on a careful consideration of what makes for a sensible transport development. And that would be 6-laning of the golden quadrilateral. Then you can have a north-south, and more importantly, you can have a link between each capital and the quadrilateral or the central lines, etc. And Mr. Vajpayee set up a group in the Planning Commission under Jaswant Singh to come out with that whole framework. So, as a matter of fact, it was a conscious attempt. And, I mentioned in my book Backstage that my friend and colleague N.K. Singh was then secretary in the Prime Minister's office. So when the Prime Minister made his speech, nobody was actually willing to say, no, that's not what we should do immediately, because that's always difficult. So I called up N.K. and I said, look, this is not the right thing to do. We'll do the north-south thing, but do it as an integrated highway development network where you give primacy to completing the golden quadrilateral, which is where the traffic is. And to his credit, he was able to get that done. And the Prime Minister made some statement saying, we must do an integrated thing and set up a group under Vajpayee, under Jaswant Singh, to actually do it. So it is true that, and most of that work, by the way, was done during UPA, not during the NDA, because while the announcement was made, when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, the actual work done, the big thrust of investment, which caused the whole boost in GDP growth, etc., most of that took place later. Now, all these things, something is announced in one government, it gets implemented in another government. I'm not making a sort of this government, that government type of argument. But what I'm saying is that infrastructure planning requires a lot of focused attention. One, to get the structure right. Then the other very important thing is, as I think Sebastian pointed out, are we or are we not clear that we need the private sector? Now, the fact is the public sector doesn't have the resources. and the private sector can do a very good job. We discovered that as we let in the private sector in all kinds of areas where people earlier thought you just couldn't do it except with the private sector. A lot of people thought airlines had to be in the public sector, airports had to be in the public sector, ports had to be in the public sector. All wrong. As a matter of fact, during the period in the UPA, some of the key ports, which earlier non-public sector ports used to be called minor ports, private sector run ports. But some of these private sector ports became larger than the major ports. So we reclassified them as non-major ports because major ports by definition were public sector. So, you know, the moment it became clear that actually you can get a lot of investment, then we ran into the problems of dispute resolution and so on. And they're serious problems because the private sector would often tell us, don't use the word public-private partnership, because once the agreement is signed, the government is no longer a partner. They view us as suspects. And that's understandable too, because if one partner wants to change something, the civil servant who has to agree to the change would be extremely hesitant to do so because it's departing from the terms that were earlier agreed. So I think, you know, these are difficult areas of institution building. And as Sebastian said, I mean, the easiest liberalization is when you're removing a control. You can't import something without getting a license, just get rid of it, let him import. How do you ration the import? You free the exchange rate. Let him buy the foreign exchange. If there's too much demand for foreign exchange, we will depreciate. Even that gets mucked up because when you open the capital account, then the capital inflow will cause the rupee to appreciate. And a lot of what you're seeing today, macro policy, is the tension between running an exchange rate which is desirable to have the right kind of trade pattern and running the exchange rate which results from the inflows that take place. So as a result, you try to prevent rupee appreciation by buying up all the reserves. That only leads to an expansion in rupee liquidity in the system. So you try to cancel that by raising the CRR or some such thing, which actually ends up being a distributional change because it's the small guys that get squeezed out. Domestic credit is squeezed because a lot of people are getting credit from abroad, and the impact of that squeeze is felt by the smaller guys. Now, you know, I mean, there are no simple answers. And I think what I liked about the book, which I hope students will realize, is that we ought to pose all these things in terms of a multi-sector, multi-constrained model, where you know, you look at all these things together. It's not easy, but there you are. That's why I earnestly suggest to Sebastian that he should make this model of his a public good. You can charge for it, as I said. Put it out as the Goa Institute of Management model. Let whoever wants to use it vary, as Sudipto pointed out, by putting in the right assumption, you can get whatever you want. But then you have an intelligent focus on what the issues are. I mean, otherwise you're just having a dialogue of the deaf. So here is my one positive contribution to the Goa Institute of Management. So Sebastian, I think you can do that. So I suggest you do.
Thank you, sir, for your second round of comments. Professor Nagaraj, do you want to have some more comments to make?
Yeah, you know, on infrastructure, I think a lot of what has been said, I think I agree. You know, but you know, interestingly, you know, we know that things have not been right with investments in the last 10 years or so. But you know, recently I was looking at gross fixed capital formation rates, that is gross fixed capital formation GDP in real terms, that is net of inflation. In fact, surprisingly, I mean, in fact, it surprised me as well, that there's been a gradual improvement in the last 3-4 years. And when I disaggregated this, I found it's all in roads, roads and communications, mostly roads, and nothing else. In fact,
So-
I wrote an op-ed in the Hindu last week where I have got these numbers reported. So if these see, on the positive side, I see it's a positive development, and probably what the finance minister currently says, look, we are driving investments. That is true. I mean, it is not public investments; it is a private investment, and within private investment, it's only roads. I'm not able to figure out where these
I'm a
roads
little
are.
puzzled to my knowledge, capital
Sorry?
formation is not broken up by sector. So where did you get that?
No, it is national accounts. National accounts gives gross fixed capital formation rate.
Yes.
Then you divide it by GDP in current
my knowledge,
inflation price.
To my knowledge, it
Sorry,
doesn't give gross.
I'll send you my paper.
Yeah, I'm just curious because I don't know.
Roads.
Sebastian will know. Does gross fixed capital formation, does it indicate by sector? I've not seen that. But,
Yeah, it is available. I mean, I'll send you my piece.
Yeah,
I'll send
do
you
that.
my op-ed.
Okay.
Yeah. But I say, I mean, in my short op-ed, I did say that indicates something positive. But where exactly it's happening, I'm not very clear. Maybe a lot of money is going into the border roads, about which probably I don't know enough. But what is surprising is the share of fixed capital formation in agriculture and industry, within industry, manufacturing have declined. And that for me is a cause for concern. I agree, infrastructure is important, but that cannot be the only thing which will pull us out. We require some balance. I mean, somewhere we require a balance.
Nagaraj, I fully agree. The point is today we are probably overdoing the roads, okay, and we are probably overdoing it because the models for bringing in private and good efficient investment in most of the other sectors are missing. This creative act was done once and nobody has been able to repeat it in other sectors. Okay, for instance, in let us say sewerage and sanitation. Okay, we don't have proper PPP models as yet. Similarly, in city infrastructure. So and in roads also, the second level or the third level, I would call it, where you get the grid and the top and that kind of the layout of the roads, the multimodality, the interconnect, the design of the roads, we are getting it all wrong. Okay, so while the roads are being built, my sense is that the value which we got in the earlier days, you're not going to get the same.
Maybe you're right, because you know so much more about infrastructure than I do. I'm looking through national accounts. Yeah. Okay, whereas you have much more disaggregated understanding. But just looking at the aggregate national accounts numbers, yeah, I found this and I thought it's worth reporting, which is what I've done. I need to do more.
Absolutely. See, the time has come right for private sector investments in manufacturing and tradable goods industries to really grow, and that's not happening. And that's the problem. Unless that happens, the growth will not get picked up.
Yeah. That is what I have flagged in my paper. Yeah, and nothing has happened under Make in India. That's unfortunate part. Yeah. Anyway, so this is just my comment to the discussion. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Professor Morris, I have a small kind of a query, you can say, not question. So can you shed light on the fact that growth and employment, there is a disconnect regarding, like we grew at a decent rate during at least 2000 and up to 2016. Yeah. After that, growth rate even fell. But even during the period, the growth rate was quite decent. The employment growth rate was very meager. So is this a sustainable kind of a way of
Yeah, see, it's certainly what you're saying is very, very important. See, the COVID, what it did is it brought, first of all, the employment growth rate from almost, let's say, 16, 17, from which the CMI data is available, has been stagnant. There has been no great growth. And at the same time, the reservation wage has not gone up. So it's not a question that the reservation wage went high and therefore hiring was not taking place. So it's clearly the case that growth in employment was slow or negligible in the past, immediate pre-COVID period, and in the COVID it declined, but the recovery has been very weak. And if you look at the manufacturing sector, It has been, there is still some 3.5, 4 million employees, employment to take place. Now, this gets clouded when you look at unemployment, because when you look at unemployment, the labor force participation also declines in a severe case of employment stress. So I've looked at employment, done the necessary adjustments, simple, and it does show that the employment pickup is not there. And even today, I would think it is not there. Okay, almost another 6 months have passed. I don't think it is there. What seemingly is there is people getting employment in the agricultural sector, which is unbelievable. And I'm not saying it. I think Mahesh Vyas has said this long ago, and so on. That look, the agricultural sector is the residual sector in terms of people running to it when there is a distress, and that, with the CMI data, is now available, because the CMI data, you can actually construct it almost on a quarterly, if not, on a monthly basis. Okay? And it does show good results. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, it's very serious. Now, what could be the reasons? One is that the COVID policies and resulted in a lot of these smaller units shutting shop, given their weaknesses. That was used as an opportunity by larger units to reform, to hire more efficient workers, more educated workers, and kind of gear up to respond. But if the demand side today is exuberant, you could have the private, middle, and larger sector responding wonderfully well, okay, and not being constrained by other factors. Okay, so I would think that it's both something positive as well as negative. Negative in the sense that workers have borne the burden of adjustment to the COVID. But if the growth rate can really pick up and grow at, say, 10%, India can look forward to a productivity of around 5%. So we can actually have a 5% employment addition, which is not an apologetic addition to employment, but a real addition to employment rate. Yeah. If the economy can be pulled up to about 9%. Because we have to factor in a 4% minimal productivity gain in India today. Thanks to the IT, thanks to the world, everything, the environment where technology is moving very rapidly.
And also the wage share is declining. This secular decline in the wage share.
Yeah, that is inevitable given the technology, and the decline in employment. But it also provides an opportunity to raise the overall output growth rate, so that even if the wage share has come down, the wages are not going to come down. The employment is not going to come down, and the labor as a class would benefit. Okay? I think we are in for a while where the wage rates are not going to grow very rapidly, because there's such a lot of disguised unemployment. And after that, if it accelerates, that would be sustainable. And all of East Asia show this. For a while, the wage rates don't rise, during which period the employment growth rate is stupendous, and then the wages really increase, keeping pace with the economy. Otherwise, it's not going to get sustainable.
And what about our reaping the demographic dividends?
I think half that has been lost. The demographic dividend that everybody knows, because we grew very slowly over the last so many years. Okay. Let me thank all of you all, and profusely, and having you here was wonderful for all of us here at the Goa Institute. So thanks. Yeah.
So we are grateful to all our distinguished speakers, Dr. Ahluwalia, Professor Sudipto Mundle, Professor Nagaraj, for their time and contribution to the discussion. We also thank our director and faculties for their support in organizing this event. I would like to especially mention Barnice D'Souza and Sneha Kanulkar for their untiring support in organizing this event. We are also thankful to our entire technology team. Pranav is with us for the entire duration. Thanks to him also. And we thank all those who have joined this program online and enriched its proceedings. Without you, this event would not have been a success. And we end this program here. Wish all you have a nice evening ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.